Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from the Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and for the next couple of weeks we will be talking about the Achilles Crusade.
So last week they discussed the origins of the Achilles Crusade, and it all went well, up until, Tiber Achilles died. This week we will be getting into the new guy's plan, and the first appendage of it is known as the Orpheus Salient. Now, first off, the new guy on the block is Solomon Tetrarchus. Solomon is the Lord Militant of the Crusade, having been ordained by the grace of the God Emperor, and has been doing so for the past 30 years. A bold man with an aggressive style of leadership, he shows a willingness to take risks and seize opportunities as they arise, traits often lacking in such high-ranking commanders of the Imperium. After taking command, he proclaimed that the Crusade forces be split into 3 army groups, committed most of the reserves his predecessor had hoarded to the front, and pressed the attack, predicting the fall of the Reach within a solar decade. The largest of these newly created Crusade forces would drive towards the core of Jericho Reach and crush the native resistance, while the other 2 would move swiftly through the sparsely inhabited rimward worlds, encircling the former Imperial sector's core. The existing slow drive towards the worlds disputed by the Tau expansion would become but one barb of the trident that would drive through the corrupted flesh of the Jericho Reach and make it once more the dominion of the God Emperor of mankind. The 3 salients were designated Canis, Acheros, and Orpheus, respectively. And regardless of the relative wisdom of his strategy, the war still continues 3 solar decades later, in the early decades of the 9th century of the 41st millennium. This week we will be looking into the Orpheus Salient, and all the horrors that entails. Now, the Orpheus Salient was launched a Terran year after Solomon Tetrarchus ascended to the position of Lord Militant, commanding the Crusade into the Jericho Reach. At that time, intelligence possessed by the Crusade's high command strongly suggested that the systems running to the rimward of the Reach were made up of sparsely populated frontier worlds, and a few formerly imperial worlds as well. These planets, while much regressed, had kept faith with the Imperial Creed and carried on in much the same way as they had before the loss of the Jericho Reach to its millennia-old era its people called
The Age of Shadow.
Some had even maintained a very haphazard contact with the Imperium and provided the Crusaders' scouting forces with aid and intelligence. It was felt that if these and other nearby worlds could be quickly brought back into Imperial control, they could both provide valuable resources to the Crusade and acting as a staging point to open a second front against the forces of the arch-enemy that were already exacting a heavy toll on the forces of the Achilles Salient. More about that next week. Command of the Orpheus Salient was given to General Michal Kuras, the youngest and most dynamic of Tetrarchus' senior command, seen by many as his favored protege. Some privately doubted that the young Kuras had the experience to drive the swift advance demanded by his commander. Their doubts proved to be in error, however, as the Orpheus Salient swiftly went forward, destroying the petty empires of secessionists and bringing loyal worlds back into the light of the Emperor. As Kuras' forces progressed, they maintained a steady stream of intelligence and assistance to the Allied Space Marine and Death Watch forces, identifying suitable targets for their attacks. In a solar decade and a half, the lead elements of the Orpheus Salient had penetrated further into the Jericho Reach than any of the Crusaders' other forces. The progress of Orpheus Salient was so successful that Lord Militant Tetrarchus began to peel elements away from it, increasing the stream of reinforcements to the Cauldron of Death around the Celebos war zone. The Battle of Eleusis was probably the most significant success of the Orpheus Salient.
When the Age of Shadows
descended upon the Jericho Reach, the shrine world of Eleusis was changed in the most foul way. The priests in attendance of the world slowly began to change the tone of their sermons. Where once they spoke of the golden light of the God Emperor, they now only spoke of that glow dimming, with another flare becoming brighter. This, they said, was obvious to anyone who looked to the sky. The bright glow of red light from the far-off Hadex anomaly was plain to see, while the astropaths brought no more messages from the Imperium. This was clearly a portent that a greater power would rise to guide the people of Eleusis to new glory and prosperity. With clever words, superstition, and likely help from beyond, the priests of Eleusis slowly began to turn the populace to the worship of the dark gods of chaos. Those that gratefully began the worship of their new saviors were given special assignments to remake the temples of the shrine world into a new and more fitting tribute to their masters. Those that remained pure to the emperor were hunted down. Many were used as sacrifices to appease the dark gods, while others were used as slaves to rebuild the temples and create new ones. So did darkness come to Eleusis. Upon the cessation of the warp storms that had hidden Eleusis from discovery, General Crusade deemed that the reconquest of the shrine world would be his most glorious victory. Not only was the plan a strategic value to his overall plans, but it carried with it the possibility of being a great morale victory for his troops. They would be able to see firsthand that the cause to which they dedicated themselves was righteous and good. Assisting Crusade with his plans were the three most senior advisors, who will go down in history as legends: Lord Commissar Vance Theron, General Darren Archelaus, and Lord Admiral Anastasia Archelaus. Together with Crusade, they represented the greatest tactical minds within the Orpheus Salient. Additionally, General Archelaus and his sister Anastasia Archelaus have been able to use their highly placed family connections to speed up requisition requests for their respective battle groups. This allowed their forces to be equipped with the best possible gear and kept their general supplies at maximum capacity. For 7 solar days, the 4 officers met in a strategic planning sessions. They did not leave the suite, as General Crusade had decreed that they would not return to their normal duties until a plan to retake Eleusis was formulated. On the 7th day, General Archelaus proposed Operation Onslaught. Within moments of hearing the proposal, General Crusade declared that they were finished. This was the plan that would retake the fallen shrine world. Operation Onslaught's order of battle called for a prolonged bombardment of the capital by Lord Admiral Archelaus' naval fleet. After precisely 17 hours and 34 minutes of orbital bombardment, a spearhead would land on the planet's surface. This spearhead would be composed of the 3rd Company of the Templars of Blood, including Scout Marines from the 10th Company mounted on assault bikes. The Space Marines had 3 key objectives. First, they were to disable the capital's communications center. This would prevent the traitors from calling for reinforcements. The second objective was to disable the spaceport defenses. This would allow the Astra Militarum to land in sufficient strength to establish a firm beachhead on the planet's surface. The final objective was for the Space Marines to act as a disruptive force once the Astra Militarum had landed. This would cause massive problems for the enemy supply lines, as well as causing the entrenched heretics to panic, as they would never be able to guess from which direction they would receive righteous retribution. The second phase of Imperial Onslaught called for General Crusade to lead a total of 30 Imperial Guard regiments to Eleusis' surface. The main thrust of this attack was comprised mostly of infantry regiments, but would be supported by an armored column of 2,000 main battle tanks. Should the second objective of Phase 1 be unsuccessful, General Crusade was to hold in orbit while the Imperial Navy resumed bombardment, targeting at the spaceport. Once on planet, the primary objective of the second phase was to capture and control any military installations remaining. Agents of the Commissariat would be deployed to townships to rouse the citizens to throw off their shackles and join the liberators to fight off the vile oppressors of the Chaos Priesthood. Should the citizens prove unwilling, artillery fire from Gun Metallican 13th Armored Regiment would destroy all habitations that could not be brought to compliance. Phase 3 of Operation Onslaught was to see the Scintillon 84th Grenadiers, under the direct command of General Archelaus, deploy to the surface and claim the planet's capital. Once they had landed, they were to push through any remaining defenders and seize the city. The Gun Metallican 13th would be available for close fire support, as well as light cruisers of the Imperial Navy for punching through any extreme resistance. This was a plan as drawn up by General Archelaus. The orbital barrage from the Imperial Navy began at precisely 0900 hours ship time and ended at 2134. Lord Admiral Archelaus called a stop of the bombardment 5 solar hours earlier than planned, as her sensor operators informed her that all significant structures and defenses had been destroyed. The 3rd Company of the Templars of Blood launched from their strike cruiser at the cessation of the barrage. Upon making planetfall, they immediately fell under attack by 15 full regiments of Chaos Cultists. Brother Captain Christophe ordered his Space Marines to abandon the first objective and proceed in force to the spaceport. as securing a landing zone for General Curus was a higher priority in his mind. His squads fought their way through the throng of cultists until they had formed a defensive perimeter around the spaceport. Tritus' squad, one of the assault squads, took to the air to get over the spaceport's walls and began demolishing efforts on the defenses surrounding the landing pads. Once the planned beachhead was secure, Captain Christoph signaled General Curus that it was time to begin the second phase of the assault. General Curas's force landed soon after the squadrons of Chimera troop transports began pouring from the landing craft, with General Curus himself on the lead transport. Seeing that the original plan needed to be adjusted, General Curus asked Captain Christoph to take his men and drive a wedge through the heart of the enemy. He also ordered the artillery regiments to begin setting up and fire for effect as soon as they had targets. He ordered a spotter to follow the Space Marines closely to provide accurate targeting data once there were friendlies within the zone of bombardment. The next order was to the gun Metallicon 13th that was even now still unloading. They were to take their heavy vehicles and begin circling around the enemy to the left flank. General Curus would take his infantry regiments to the right flank and clean up anything that the Space Marines had missed. When General Arculus landed, he found that the Templars of Blood had left no traitors alive as they cleared a way to the capital. On the left flank, the gun Metallicon 13th had met with similar success and was even now pushing into main thoroughfares. On the right flank, General Curus had led his men to a stunning victory. As his command Chimera pulled up to the main capital building, General Arculus had enough time to climb to the top of the rubble before he saw General Curus summarily execute the High Priest of Eleusis and plant the Imperial Aquila standard in front of the Grand Temple. As the planets began to fall for General Curus, portions of his task force started to be redeployed in different salients. Lord Militant Tetrarchus felt that they would be put to better use in the more hostile zones of the Crusade. This was to be a costly miscalculation on the part of the Lord Militant. On 999.812.m41, astropathic communications began to flicker in and out. The salients sectioned psychers, and astropaths began receiving strange dreams of terrible creatures devouring all that they saw. Hearing of this unknown shadow that was interfering with his communications, General Curus transferred his command to Battlegroup Argo and immediately ordered them into the heart of the shadow. 6 solar months went by without any word from Battlegroup Argo, when a stray picket ship was found floating in space by Lord Admiral Arculus. Taking the ship into the hold, she recovered the ship's logs and discovered the grim fate of the Battlegroup Argo. After plunging his group into the location of the disruption of the warp, General Curus discovered the disruption was a previously unknown force of Tyranids, a numberless fleet of massive bioships and ravaging alien organisms. The very presence of these terrible creatures created a shadow in the warp that disrupted all communications. All the ships within his battle group had been destroyed, and the general himself was killed when his vessel was boarded by the Tyranids. Knowing the damage that this information could do to the Crusade's morale, Lord Admiral Arculus sealed the logs and made all haste to meet up with the late general's senior advisors. In orbit around the fortress world of Heathgard, General Darren Arculus, Lord Admiral Anastasia Arculus, and Lord Commissar Vance Theron met aboard the general's flagship to discuss what should be done. Now, before we go on, I should probably give you a bit of a background on these three, because we're going to be talking about them quite a bit. Let's start with the siblings. General Darren Arculus is the eldest highborn son of the noble house Arculus on Scantilia, the capital world of the Calexis sector. He is a masterful strategist and an ambitious young officer who dreamed of succeeding General Curus. Unfortunately for Arculus, his capabilities as a field leader are sorely lacking for a man of his station, though he appears unaware of his deficiencies in this regard. As one of General Curus's advisors, his talent for strategic matters came to the fore, and he thrived as a member of the Salient's general staff, as we saw his plans worked so splendidly on Eleusis. However, his distance from the front lines put him often at odds with General Curus, because Curus noticed with his distance from his troops, Arculus was quite callous and uncaring of the soldiers under his command, who he regarded more as statistics to be calculated and variables to be accounted for. As for the Space Marines, to him they simply represent another force that should be under his direct control, and he sees them as nothing but glory seekers who are denying him the chance to prove himself worthy to be Curus's successor. As you can imagine, this did wonders for his persona when it came to the Emperor's Angels. His sister, Anastasia, on the other hand, is another animal entirely. Even though she's the younger of the two, she has enjoyed a more successful career than her older brother, having reached the higher ranks of the Admiralty while still only in her first century of life. She's also an excellent tactician, albeit in naval engagements, but she commands the respect of her crew and the captains of her fleet. Those that serve her understand that while their souls belong to the god Emperor, their lives belong to her. At the beginning of the Achilles Crusade, she served as a rear admiral, newly promoted, overseeing the movement of vessels through the Jericho Maw warp gate and liaising with the Battlefleet Colexis Admiralty to maintain supply lines. After Lord Militant Tiber Achilles' death, Achilles found herself elevated to the rank of admiral as Lord Militant Solomon Tetrarchus began to rearrange the Crusade's command staff, placed in command of the 6 Admiral Navy battle groups of the Orpheus Salient, Icarus, Argo, Cerberus, Daedalus, Vishnu, and Santos. She was shortly thereafter elevated to Lord Admiral and commander of all Imperial naval forces within the Salient. Now, Achilles understands the weight of command well, and the burdens of the Admiralty are great indeed, with the lives of hundreds of millions of souls on thousands of ancient, venerated, and often irreplaceable starships within her hands. She has earned the utmost respect from the crew of her flagship, the battleship Emperor's Nobility, and by the admirals, commodores, and captains of her fleet. Now finally, the piece de resistance, Commissar Vance Thurin. Educated at the Schola Progenium on Veneris, Vance Thurin has faithfully served the commissariat for the past 65 solar years. The most senior commissar in the Orpheus Salient, Thurin has presided over matters of military discipline since the first day of the Salient's foundation. A veteran of many conflicts, Thurin has served both on the ground alongside the Astra Militarum and as a fleet commissar with the Imperial Navy, giving him valuable experience in a variety of theaters of war and making him an ideal choice for such a high authority. His oversight of all Astra Militarum and Imperial Navy activities within the Salient is carried out through a means of thousands of lesser commissars stationed aboard starships and deployed within Astra Militarum regiments. He was assigned to the Achilles Crusade from the outset and was attached as a liaison to General Mikhail Curus's staff. A dutiful and honorable man, Thurin does not suffer the wasteful use of the Emperor's armed forces, regarding the lives of the Emperor's servants as something not to be expended frivolously or rashly. Indeed, quite at odds with the archetypical image of the commissar, Thurin actually cares about the soldiers under his authority. This has caused him to clash with generals under his jurisdiction on several occasions, even going so far as to veto the battle plans of General Darren Archelaus more than once, and having executed several senior Astra Militarum officers for negligence over the years of the Achilles Crusade. Further, he has reprimanded several of his subordinate commissars for being overzealous in their punishments. The lives of the Emperor's servants are valuable, and it is the responsibility of their leaders to ensure that the dutiful efforts of even the least of men are employed wisely, as Thurin is swift to point out to his subordinates. In spite of this atypical outlook, Thurin is a stern disciplinarian, having established a collection of penal companies in order to deal with those who step out of line, and commandeering a special battalion of veteran troops to serve as military police, as he has found that squads of exceptionally disciplined troops, unbound by a regimental loyalty, make effective enforcers. Like I said before, part of the Achilles Crusade from the very start, Thurin had served closely with General Curus, and he held the general in high regard, almost from the outset. The death of General Curus at the hands of the Tyranids hit Thurin hard. While they could not be considered friends, the two men had a mutual respect for one another, and General Curus would often take Thurin into his confidence about private command matters. Curus's death was an emotional blow to Theron, though his stern demeanor would not allow his acute sense of loss to show. Well, now that you know a little bit more about these three, let's get back to what they are going to do now that Curus is dead. During their closed meeting, the remaining senior members of the Orpheus Salient command structure began discussing what should be done about General Curus's death. Within solar minutes, it devolved into petty bickering between the general and the admiral over who would take command. Lord Commissar Theron allowed this to go on for approximately 30 seconds before he fired his bolt pistol into the ceiling. Warning that the next round would go into the head of the first person to interrupt him, he outlined a plan for the command structure that was bold, to say the least. Theron's plan was to inform the other Salient commanders of General Curus's death at the hands of the Tyranids. But with communication blackouts, he knew that it could take Terran years for such a message to be received, and years beyond that for a response to be sent back. During this period, no one, beyond the three of them and the Crusade's high command, was to know of the death of General Curus, until a replacement had been sent. In the meantime, and to keep the discipline and morale of the Orpheus Salient at workable levels, Theron proposed that a triumvirate be formed to command the Salient. General Arculus would be in command of all ground operations, Admiral Arculus would be in command of all naval actions, and Lord Commissar Theron would play the mediator, as well as having final say over any disagreements that cropped up. Now, commanding from the flagship of the battle group Cerberus, Lord Commissar Theron was able to effectively deceive the rest of the ranking members of the Imperial Guard and Imperial Navy by combining his authority with that of either one of the Arculus siblings. The word of a Lord Commissar, backed up by either a Lord Admiral or a General, is something no lower-ranking officer would dare question. Things seemed to be going well for the triumvirate until 999.812.M41. Astropathic communications between various worlds and battle groups of the Orpheus Salient began to blink out, and what limited messages did get through were sporadic, sinister, and barely intelligible. The astropaths and other sanctioned psychers across the length of the Salient awoke screaming from dreams filled with an endless darkness and 1,000 rustling whispers. Some took their own lives, and many others were reduced to babbling phrases about the rising tide and hungering depths, or similarly doom-laden ravings. Thanks to the communication blackouts, no one in high command knew the disposition or activities of forces along the Salient, nor could they exert any cohesive control over them, while the Adeptus Astartes grew withdrawn, keeping their own grim counsel on the matter. Snatches of information that emerge over the coming solar months seem to indicate that some elements of the Salient's force had been lost, and that previously secure worlds had come under siege. It was as if a creeping shadow had enveloped the Salient, within which terrible events had begun to unfold. The doom of Orpheus Salient, and perhaps the entire Achilles Crusade, was given a name only from a rare open communications from the mysterious Death Watch. The Tyranids of High Fleet Dagon had come to Jericho Reach. Since that time, the Crusade forces along the Orpheus Salient have been brutally hammered and now are estimated to muster at less than 50% of their prior effective combat strength. Their leadership is fractured and their morale severely, perhaps fatally, compromised, while the vital fortress world of Heathguard has now come under siege from a massive Tyranid assault. You see, the earliest encounters with what would eventually be designated as High Fleet Dagon, like I mentioned earlier, went almost entirely unnoticed by the Achilles Crusade High Command. The first Tyranid bioforms encountered were gene-stealer hybrids, and the members of the planet's enforcers that destroyed them thought them to be merely hideously deformed human mutants. It was not until an encounter with a full-scale infestation on the death world of Herosor that word of the new Xenos threat reached the ears of the leadership of the Crusade. Now, we have to take a step back slightly and mention how Battle Group Argo actually was destroyed. My apologies, but sometimes we have to move backwards to see forwards. Anyways, where was I? Oh yeah. Slightly over a standard year after the communiques from Herosor, Battle Group Argo returned to Herosor to find the landscape completely changed, and no sign of the pioneers or the members of the Adeptus Mechanicus. the Iexan Tithe Guard were sent down to the surface to investigate what happened. Once they had made planetfall, the troops who had been there previously were stunned to find that in place of a barren wasteland was now a mighty tundra that stretched as far as the eye could see. The commander of the Tithe Guard sent out scout patrols in all directions to attempt to find the trace of the missing group. For the first solar hour or so, all was normal. No sign of the previous landing group, but nothing to indicate what happened to them. That's when all communications were lost, except for one broken transmission. The commander of the Iexans had his communication officer relay a message to the fleet in orbit, along with his plans for dealing with this new menace on the planet's surface. Receiving an acknowledgement from command, he proceeded to carry out his mission. The Iexans were never heard from again. After receiving the foreboding message from the Iexan 7th Regiment, General Curus deployed Battle Group Cerberus, under the command of Lord Admiral Arculus, back through the Warp Shadow. Her task was to send a message directly to Lord Solomon Tetrarchus and any officer of the Adeptus Astartes regarding this new and terrible threat. Cerberus immediately departed back towards the Iron Collar at all possible speed. The ship stopped once for their navigator to realign himself with the Astronomicon, and during this brief stopover, they encountered the strike cruiser Belron. Seeing it was a Space Marine void ship, Admiral Arculus transmitted the message to them, then proceeded on towards her original goal. What she did not realize was that the strike cruiser Belron was currently under extended secondment to the Ordo Xenos to transport the Death Watch to a new location within the Orpheus Salient. Hearing the message, Inquisitor Gent had the captain of the vessel come to a new heading. The Death Watch headed directly to Herosor. This new information had to be confirmed with all possible speed. If the Tyranids had indeed come to Jericho Reach, then they were now more pressing matters to deal with than the recent surges in Tau activity around the Black Reef. Before there was any Death Watch intervention, 50 Astartes of the Storm Wardens chapter fought to stop the Tyranids or at least slow their advance on Herosor. Eventually, the Death Watch was sent to aid the Storm Wardens' operations on the planet. When the Death Watch arrived on Herosor, they deployed in numbers more akin to typical Codex Astartes planetary siege than the usual small kill team deployment. More than 50 Death Watch Space Marines deployed to the surface that day. They fought a campaign that lasted nearly 6 solar months, until they were convinced that the menace was ended. The Death Watch aided the Storm Wardens with surgical strikes on Tyranid spore chimneys and synapse creatures with the support of the strike cruiser Belleron in orbit. From status reports, Inquisitor Gent became increasingly concerned when he noted that the Tyranids were holding the chapel of St. Erit and the city surrounding it hostage. He assumed that they were attracted to a relic of something, or else present in the area radiating a psychic signature. The campaign ground on for solar months, and every opportunity was taken to prevent the Tyranid swarm from reaching critical mass. Gent decided to send a Death Watch kill team, along with one of his trusted acolytes, to survey the chapel and recover whatever relics resided within. The kill team, designated Lux Veritas, reached the chapel and reported the discovery of a relic of great power. Soon after, they were overrun by Tyranids and called for an orbital bombardment of the area. All contact with the Death Watch team was subsequently lost. The Lux Veritas was later presumed dead after flyby reconnaissance reports noted the remains of armor similar to theirs and that of the Inquisitor Acolyte strewn about the battle site. After the end of the campaign, when the Tyranid menace had been defeated, Inquisitor Gent had the planet declared a death world to ward off any who would be greedy enough to attempt harvesting its natural resources. Of the original 50 Death Watch Astartes deployed to Herosor, only 20 made it back alive. At the same time that the Death Watch were attacking the Tyranid forces on Herosor, word of this new threat had reached Lord Militant Solomon Tetrarchus. He quickly requested the battle barge Bloodsword to investigate where these creatures had come from. By tracing a line amongst the stable warp routes, the navigators aboard the Bloodsword came upon what may have been the first planet infected by the Tyranid swarm within the Jericho Reach. It took 3 long solar months of warp travel before the Astartes of the Bloodsword were able to set foot on the planet that was once known as Xanatov's Harbor. The Death Watch estimated that at least 9 formerly inhabited worlds had already been completely overrun by the Tyranids of High Fleet Dagon. 6 more are under immediate threat or are already engaged in fighting, while the fate of at least 20 other systems, lost under the umbra of the Great Devourer's shadow in the warp, remains unknown. Xanatov's harbor was named for the legendary rogue trader, Corsair Captain Xanatov. This planet was one he frequented on his trade runs coming in from the eastern fringe of the galaxy. At one point, it boasted excellent void ship repair facilities, and the lack of contact with the Imperium made an excellent place for smugglers and other members of the so-called cold trade to meet up and swap goods. This all changed at the end of 812.M41. Early reports recovered after the fact state that many people saw what they believed to be a meteor shower in the night sky. No one thought much of it, as meteor showers are often a good omen for void ship captains. Slowly, the reports began to filter in. These were no mere meteorites that had hit the ground, but instead housed a more sinister cargo of tyrannid bioorganisms. The merchants and crew on the surface put up a decent fight, but they were utterly outmatched by the lethal organic killing machines. Some managed to make their way to their void ships, but found that larger organisms were floating through the void, firing caustic projectiles of biological nature. None survived the onslaught of the ravenous beasts. All that were on the planet were devoured, their genetic patterns added to a primordial soup that comprised Hive Fleet Dagon's gene pool. Ships in orbit were left abandoned. Most had had their hulls ruptured in hundreds of places by tyrannid biospores, attaching to the hull and ate their way inside. Many ships not completely wrecked were now floating abattoirs, a sickening testament to the utter brutality of the tyrannid swarm on the warpath. So it was that Brother Captain Christoph and his company of Templars of Blood Astartes made their way to this graveyard of a planet. They expected to have to use the battle barge's bombardment cannons to clear the way of tyrannid vessels, and then deploy Thunderhawk gunships, as they would not be able to get close enough to use drop pods. What they actually encountered was something far worse. When the Blood Sword translated back into real space, it found nothing but a dead planet. Every bit of biological material had been stripped bare from the planet's surface. Setting down into the Thunderhawks, the Templars began a thorough search of the planet for any clues as to how the massive Hive Fleet had arrived in Jericho Reach. Realizing that he could not take a full battle company off of the front lines, Brother Captain Christoph left behind a small contingent of his available Space Marines to continue the investigation. Currently, there has been no communication from the Space Marines left behind that day, but the commanders of the Orpheus Salient still hold out hope that someday there will be news that can help them turn the tide of this war. Backed into a corner by every encroaching swarm of Tyranids, the Austro-Militarum forces in the region began to retreat towards the Iron Collar. Lord Commissar Theron and General Arculus pulled almost all the Imperial Guardsmen who were not already engaged with the Tyranids back to the feral world of Trajan. Here, they determined, was their line in the proverbial sand. They would fall back no further, and they would either die to the man, or push the foul Xenos back into the warp from whence they came. A largely temperate world, Trajan's population is centered primarily in the Western Hemisphere. The last Imperial census had the population at roughly 250,000, with an average technology level equivalent to that of the Terran Bronze Age. The primary star within the system is entered into its last stages of life, and as such, solar flares are beginning to spread a blanket of radiation around the planet. This has a nasty habit of causing long-range Vox transmissions to be unreliable at best, but it also seems to have an equal effect upon the psychic communications of the Tyranids on planet. Trajan was chosen as a suitable battleground by the leaders of the Orpheus Salient for these specific peculiarities. When the Achilles Crusade first encountered the planet Trajan, it was found that the natives there worshipped their sun as a god. While this deity provided them with warmth, he could also bring terrible vengeance upon them when he was angered. The ecclesiarchy had little trouble in slightly altering the perception of the natives, so that the god emperor of mankind was seen in the same light as their false sun god. He would provide them with warmth, shelter, food, and protection, but if they ever angered him, or his chosen representative, he would strike down upon them with a furious anger the likes of which they had never seen. While the Departamento Minitorum was attempting to calculate what the planet's tithe grading would be, it was discovered by an adventurous group of the Imperial Guardsmen that the large native beasts had a unique pelt that, when skinned, had the ability to change coloration with the lighting. With this discovery, the planet's primary export was quickly changed from baseline foodstuffs to luxury goods. Rumor has it that General Darren Arculus himself has his Crusade dress uniform made from this hide. No one has seen this uniform, but it would fit his public persona. After classifying and settling the planet, a small defense force was left behind, mainly to hold off any orcs attempting to raid this deep into the Crusaders' lines. Much of their time on planet was spent with very little to do, as the native population was fairly tame and had nothing but love for the God Emperor. Now, occasionally, there would be a small uprising by one of the tribes that would have been displaced when the Imperial Guard claimed certain land as their headquarters. But savages with swords and axes do very little against trained men with las guns. At the beginning of 815.M41, the small garrison received a rather abrupt wake-up call. Lord Commissar Theron and battle group Cerberus arrived in force to stand in the way of the new Xenos threat that was approaching. When Theron landed, he exited his lander quickly and set up a command post inside the Ostra Militarum headquarters for himself and the rest of the Triumvirate. Immediate orders were given to begin erecting defensible positions. Swarms of Adeptus Mechanicus servitors skittered off the lander in his wake and began stripping the compound of all materials needed to enhance the base's defense. Over the next 2 solar weeks, 33 full regiments of the Ostra Militarum, almost the entirety of the Orpheus Salient complement, landed with the Scatillian 84th Grenadiers and General Darren Arculus at their head. Artillery pieces were quickly placed in defensible positions. Sentinels and snipers were sent to reconnoiter the surrounding terrain. Lord Commissar Theron barricaded himself in his command post with General Arculus in an attempt to find a way to effectively hold the line at Trienne. It wasn't until the 15th solar day that Theron received 3 communications. The first was from Lord Admiral Arculus, saying that if the shadow being cast in the warp was any indication, the Tyranid fleet was massive. The second came from the Dark Suns chapter of the Space Marines. The veteran First Company, with its squads of Terminators, would be arriving in 3 solar days. The third was from his fleet Astropath. Unfortunately, the Tyranids would be arriving in 2 solar days. When the Tyranid fleet arrived, Lord Admiral Arculus proved to any doubters exactly how she had achieved her position. Fully 1/3 of all Tyranid vessels were destroyed in the naval engagement above Trienne. Her fleet was badly damaged, but she was still able to order her picket ships in to provide close fire support for the upcoming battle. On the ground, despite the situation in orbit, the task ahead of the 16 million guardsmen seemed hopeless. What appeared to be a monsoon of living monstrosities began pouring out of the sky, and wave upon wave of hungry Xenos beasts rushed towards the Imperial battle lines. For 24 solar hours, the entire planet of Trienne was a battlefield. Millions of Imperial Guard were killed, and even more were wounded. 18 solar hours into the engagement, streaks of light came hurtling towards the planet's surface. Over the communication system came the message telling Lord Commissar Theron to order a full counterassault in directly 1 solar hour. Attached to the message were the authorization codes of the Death Watch. Precisely 1 hour later, the Tyranid horde fell into absolute disarray, and Lord Commissar Theron sent planet-wide orders to begin the counter-assault. 5 hours after that, Lord Commissar Theron met up with the Death Watch kill teams that had been inserted on the planet via drop pod. These kill teams had destroyed the largest Tyranid bioforms, thus disrupting the creature's ability to psychically communicate with one another. With no enemy leadership in place, the Imperial Guard were able to take advantage of the Tyranids' confusion and drive them back into an open area where the fleet in orbit could bombard the Xenos. When compiling his after-action report, General Arculus noted that if the Tyranids had continued engaging the fleet in orbit, it would have been impossible for the Death Watch to get close enough to be successful. By committing to an all-out attack too early, the Tyranids had cost themselves the battle. When the Dark Suns arrived the next day, they were quickly able to hunt down and remove all obvious signs of Tyranid infestations. All 3 Ostra Militarum commanders were acknowledged for their bravery and skill in handling what would normally have been an impossible situation. The one drawback was that the attacking Tyranid force had now splintered apart. One splinter fleet moved towards Heathgard, and the other appeared to be heading towards Tryphon. Fresh from their successful defense of Traian, the Triumvirate decided that they would now have to make a gamble on their next move. The Tyranid infestations must be wiped clean from the Jericho Reach, so as not to risk another splinter fleet moving somewhere else and continuing the destruction. Lord Admiral Arculus suggested that they concentrate their naval resources into one massive fleet and overwhelm the Tyranids at every encounter. Her brother suggested luring the Xenos to either an uninhabited or sparsely inhabited world and just bombarding them from orbit. Lord Commissar Theron had another idea. The battlegroup Cerberus would swing coreward and skirt the edges of the Orpheus Salient until they had reached the end of the push. At this point, they would turn about and begin to give chase after the trailing edges of the Hive fleet. Battlegroup Daedalus would move rimward and skirt the other edge of the Salient. They would then hold position until they received acknowledgement that Battlegroup Cerberus were in place. At this point, the two fleets would converge on the Tyranids and make them pay for the suffering that they had caused the Imperial Crusade. Now, this has not taken place yet, so only time will tell if their plan is successful. Well, folks, that's all the time I have for today. Join us next time as we discuss the Arqueros Salient and the many struggles the Imperium have against the forces of chaos. If you enjoyed this box, feel free to like, follow, comment, and of course, subscribe. Have a great day, and as always,
until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.